The Odysseus shudders violently as it tears through Titan's thick orange sky. Alarms scream and red emergency lights flash across the cockpit. Commander Eva Rostova grips her console, her knuckles white, and shouts to her crew to brace for impact. The colony beacon is offline. Something is terribly wrong down there. This audiobook will plunge you into a sci-fi horror survival story where a rescue mission becomes a desperate fight for existence. You will unravel the chilling mystery of a silent colony and face a threat that rewrites life itself. What kind of terror could silence an entire outpost on a distant moon? The landing struts sank deep into the methane slush with a final, weary groan. Around them, the frigid air steamed where hot metal met frozen ground. Eva cycled the main airlock, the hiss of equalizing pressure the only sound breaking the profound quiet. Her boots crunched onto the gritty, frozen surface of Titan, the first human steps here in over a decade. Before them, Prometheus Base sat like a forgotten tomb. Its geodesic domes, designed to glitter under the hazy orange sky, were dull and dark. No lights flickered from the viewports. No hum of machinery vibrated through the ground. The main airlock door was sealed tight, a solid sheet of metal where a welcoming gateway should have been. This was not the bustling scientific outpost they were sent to save. It was a monument to silence. Every instinct told Eva to turn back, to flee this place, but the mission demanded answers. She motioned for her crew to follow, their own footsteps a stark, lonely rhythm against the overwhelming stillness. What could have happened here to leave a colony so utterly and completely hushed? The main airlock door resisted with a low, metallic groan, its manual override stiff from disuse. Eva leaned her weight into the heavy wheel, muscles straining until, with a final protesting shriek, the seal broke. A wave of stale, frigid air washed over them, carrying the sterile scent of recycled atmosphere and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible odor of decay. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Their helmet lamps cut narrow beams through the void, illuminating a corridor of stark, utilitarian gray. The floor was clean, the walls undamaged, yet the silence was a physical weight. Engineer Liam Chen's gloved finger tapped rapidly on his wrist scanner. His voice was a hushed whisper, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "Life support is nominal," he said. "The air is breathable, temperature stable, but there is no power to the comms array." His words hung in the air for a moment before he delivered the final, chilling reading. "And my biosigns sweep is blank. No signs of life anywhere in the complex. The confirmation should have been a relief, a clean answer. Instead, it deepened the mystery, making the sterile corridor feel like a gilded cage." Then a flicker, a mere suggestion of motion at the far edge of Liam's lamplight, deep within the corridor. It was gone before anyone could focus, a phantom shift in the shadows. No one spoke. Eva simply raised a clenched fist, the universal signal to halt, and pointed two fingers toward the darkness. They proceeded with a new, heightened caution, each footstep placed with deliberate care, their senses screaming into the void ahead. What could move in a place the scanners declared utterly and completely dead? The command center felt like a violated tomb. Their helmet lights swept across a scene of deliberate destruction. Consoles were not merely broken, they were pulverized, their screens a spiderweb of cracks and their innards spilling out like metallic entrails. Wires hung from open panels in limp, useless coils. Every single data drive bay was empty, the slots gaping open, picked clean of their informational skeletons. Someone or something had systematically erased the colony's memory. Eva's heart sank. This was not an accident or a system failure, it was a purge. Security Chief Marcus Thorne moved with a predator's grace through the wreckage, his gloved hand brushing over a fractured keyboard. His light caught a torn corner of plastic sheet tucked underneath it. He pulled it free, holding it up for the others to see. The writing was a frantic, jagged scrawl, etched with what looked like a burnt piece of wire. It held only 3 words, a message that turned the sterile air to ice. "They are in the walls," as if summoned by the very reading of the note. A sound answered from the darkness. It was a dry, scraping noise, like heavy stones being dragged over metal. It echoed faintly, impossibly, through the complex network of ventilation shafts that snaked above the ceiling. The sound seemed to move, shifting from one location to another, a ghostly patrol in the spaces between rooms. Liam's scanner, still clutched in his hand, remained stubbornly silent, detecting no movement, no heat signature, no life. Yet the scraping persisted, a physical contradiction to the electronic truth. Without a word, Eva unclipped the pulse rifle from her maglock. The low hum of its power cell engaging was the most comforting sound she had heard since landing. Marcus did the same, his movements fluid and practiced, his expression grim. The note was no longer just a message. It was a warning they were already too late to heed. The investigation was over. Now the hunt had begun. They had to find the source of that noise, to look their silent enemy in the eye, whatever it might be. The scraping sound faded into the depths of the ventilation system, leaving them in a silence that was somehow worse. Eva led the way out of the command center, her rifle a steady extension of her will. Their path took them through a long, curved corridor marked with faded signage for the agricultural sector. The heavy door to the hydroponics dome was sealed, just like the main airlock, but the manual wheel here was crusted over with a rough, crystalline substance. Liam had to use a pry bar to crack it loose, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hall. When the seal finally broke, the door did not simply open. It was pushed outward by a surge of warm, wet air that smelled overwhelmingly of damp soil and something sweetly chemical. Their helmet lamps pierced the gloom, revealing a scene of terrifying transformation. This was no longer a cultivated garden. It was a jungle. The orderly rows of growth trays were shattered and buried under a tangled mat of grotesque, overgrown flora. Leaves were swollen and veined with pulsing purple lines, and tubers had burst from their containers like bloated, alien organs. The very walls of the dome were invisible, completely smothered under a thick, creeping carpet of bioluminescent fungi that cast a sickly, greenish-blue glow across the entire cavernous space. It was beautiful, in the way a venomous creature is beautiful, and utterly horrifying. Marcus kept his weapon trained on the shifting shadows while the team's botanist, Dr. Eris Thorne, stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. She knelt, carefully avoiding a thick, rope-like vine, and scraped a sample of the glowing fungus into a portable analyzer. The device whirred softly, its screen illuminating her faceplate. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, audible intake. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and dread. "This is not any Earth organism I have ever seen. Its protein structures are entirely novel." She looked up, her eyes wide as she met Eva's gaze. "Commander, it is not just growing here. It is actively altering the plant DNA, rewriting it at a fundamental level." As if her words were a trigger, the thick vine she had so carefully avoided suddenly twitched. It was a subtle, muscular contraction, like the flex of a serpent. Before anyone could react, it lashed out with shocking speed, wrapping itself around Eris' forearm with a sound like cracking leather. She cried out, more in surprise than pain, as the vine constricted, pulling her off balance. Marcus was the closest. He didn't hesitate. He fired a single, precise burst from his pulse rifle. The energy bolt seared through the fibrous tissue, and the vine recoiled, its severed end writhing on the floor and leaking a sap that smoked and hissed. In that same moment, the entire dome seemed to awaken. A chorus of dry, rustling whispers rose from the darkness as other vines began to stir, uncoiling from the twisted metal supports, their movements purposeful and predatory. "Go, now, back to the corridor." Eva's command was low and urgent, her rifle sweeping across the advancing vegetation as she covered their retreat. They stumbled back through the doorway, Liam slamming the heavy metal door shut and spinning the wheel until it locked with a solid, final clunk. From the other side, they could hear a soft, relentless thudding, the sound of the mutated Flora testing its new prison. They stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, the sterile air of the corridor feeling fragile and thin. The silence of Prometheus Base was no longer a mystery. It was a lie, a prelude to a nightmare that was very much alive and waiting for them just out of sight. The relentless thudding against the hydroponics door faded behind them as they retreated deeper into the base's industrial heart. The corridor widened into a vast cargo bay, a cavernous space where towering stacks of supply crates formed a silent, metallic maze. The air here was cold and still, thick with the smell of rust and dust. Their lights cut swaths through the gloom, illuminating serial numbers and faded shipping manifests. They were searching for anything, a tool, a power cell, some clue that wasn't trying to eat them, when a shadow detached itself from behind a stack of containers. It was a human silhouette, moving with a furtive, jerky panic. It darted between the crates, a flicker of stained fabric and pale skin. Marcus was on it in an instant. He moved like a shadow himself, his pursuit silent and efficient, cutting off the figure's escape routes with practiced ease. He cornered it against a wall of locked storage lockers, his rifle raised but not aimed, his body a controlled barrier. The figure shrank back, pressing itself against the cold metal, and their lights finally illuminated her fully. It was a woman, her face gaunt and smudged with grime, her eyes wide with a primal terror. She wore the tattered remains of a Science Division jumpsuit, the name Petrova stitched over a frayed pocket. Her breath came in ragged, visible puffs in the frigid air. "You are alive," Eva said, her voice low and steady, a deliberate calm meant to soothe. "We are from the Odysseus. We are here to rescue you. The woman, Doctor." Lena Petrova let out a choked, hysterical sound that was nowhere near a laugh. Her eyes darted past them, scanning the darkness between the crates. Her voice was a dry, papery whisper, so faint they had to lean in to hear. "You should not have come." Her gaze locked on Eva's, filled with a desperate, heartbreaking pity. "You do not understand. They are not killing us, they are harvesting us." The word hung in the air, vile and heavy. Before anyone could form a question, a new sound answered from the darkness. It was not the dry scrape of the vents or the rustle of vines. This was a skittering, a rapid, multi-limbed tapping against the metal deck plates and the container walls. A sound like 1,000 scurrying insects, and it was closing in from all sides. There was no time to think, only to react. Liam spotted a heavy-duty laboratory door, its reinforced window dark, just a dozen paces away. "Go, now," Eva barked, shoving Dr. Petrova toward it. They ran, a frantic, stumbling sprint as the skittering swelled into a deafening cascade, seeming to pour from the very ceiling. Marcus fired a wild, suppressing burst of plasma fire behind them, the brilliant flashes illuminating for a split second a shifting, chittering tide of shadows flowing over the crates. Liam hit the door release, and they tumbled through into the pitch-black lab, heaving the door shut just as something heavy and sharp slammed against the other side. The magnetic lock engaged with a solid thump, sealing them in. For now, with only the frantic, terrified breathing of the last colonist of Prometheus Base, and the horrifying truth she had just delivered. The door shuddered again, the metal groaning under the assault from outside. In the absolute darkness of the sealed lab, the only light came from the faint, panicked glow of their helmet faceplates and the frantic pulse of the red emergency lock on the door. Dr. Lena Petrova huddled against a cold equipment cabinet, her body trembling as she hugged her knees. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raw, broken thing. "You saw the garden. That was just the beginning, the spillover. The main colony is not dead. It has been repurposed. She fumbled in a pouch on her torn jumpsuit, her fingers shaking as she pulled out a small, cracked data slate. The screen flickered to life, casting her gaunt, terrified face in a ghostly blue light. "The excavation team," she began, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "We broke through into a new cavern system, deep under the central spire. We thought we had found a new energy signature. We were wrong." She tapped the screen, and a grainy, shaky video began to play. It was helmet cam footage, the view jostling as the geologist wearing it ran his light over a cavern wall. The rock was not rock at all, but a porous, black, organic-looking lattice that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. "We found an organism," Lena whispered, her eyes fixed on the horrific footage. "A subterranean intelligence. It does not attack with teeth or claws. It infects through the air. Microscopic spores, they do not just make you sick. They rewrite you." On the slate, the geologist reached out a gloved hand, brushing it against the pulsing lattice. A cloud of fine, glittering dust puffed into the air, filling the camera's view for a moment. The video cut, then resumed from a different angle, a fixed camera in a medical bay. The same geologist was strapped to a gurney, convulsing violently. His back arched off the bed, his limbs thrashing against the restraints. Then, the most terrifying change began. The veins around his eyes and temples began to darken, branching out under his skin like black tree roots. His eyes flew open, but they were no longer human. They glowed with a sickly, piercing green light, an intelligent, alien malevolence that stared directly into the soul of the viewer. The convulsions stopped. His body went still, and then he calmly, methodically began to test his restraints. His movements now fluid and unnervingly coordinated. He was gone. The man we knew was erased, his mind overwritten, his body just a host. Lena shut off the slate, plunging them back into near darkness. The silence in the lab was heavier than before, thick with the weight of her revelation. The scraping in the vents, the vines in hydroponics, they were not the enemy itself. They were just the symptoms, the tendrils of a consciousness that had been sleeping beneath their feet, waiting for someone to foolishly wake it up. The colonists were not dead. They were something infinitely worse. They were part of it now, a distributed network of eyes and hands for a hive mind that saw them not as invaders, but as raw material. And they were sealed in a dark room, listening to the skittering of their harvesters just on the other side of the door. That skittering sound outside the door began to change, softening into a strange, wet, percussive rhythm. It was the sound of bursting, like overripe fruit hitting the ground, over and over again. A new, coppery smell began to seep into the room from the vents, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. Liam's wrist scanner, which had been stubbornly silent, suddenly chirped a high-pitched, urgent alarm. His face, illuminated by the device's glow, went pale. "Commander," he said, his voice tight. "Environmental sensors are picking up a massive spike in airborne particulate. It's not dust. The concentration is building fast out there." Dr. Petrova whimpered, pulling the collar of her jumpsuit up over her nose and mouth. "The spores," she whispered, her voice muffled by fabric. "They are releasing the spores." There was no time for debate. Eva slapped the release on the storage compartment of her suit, pulling out the compact emergency respirator units and tossing them to her crew. They were simple masks with integrated goggles, designed for short-term exposure to toxic fumes, not a sustained biological assault. They secured them over their faces, the hiss of filtered air a fragile comfort. Liam kept his eyes glued to his scanner, the numbers on the screen climbing at an alarming rate. "The filters will not hold if the density increases any further," he stated, his tone grim and factual. "The particulate is too fine. It will clog the systems in a matter of minutes. We need to purge this entire section, now." The only way to do that was to override the local atmospheric controls and vent the contaminated air directly into the vacuum of space. It was a desperate, dangerous move. It would create a violent decompression in the corridor, potentially damaging the base's structural integrity and sucking out anything not bolted down, including their mysterious attackers. It was also their only chance. The atmospheric control panel was on the far side of the cargo bay, a dozen meters from the safety of their sealed lab door. Eva met Marcus' eyes and he gave a single, sharp nod. He understood the risk. He would provide cover. Eva took a deep breath of the clean air from her mask, her hand hovering over the door release. "On my mark," she said, her voice firm. "We get to that panel, initiate the purge sequence, and get back. Ready?" The moment the door slid open, the coppery smell hit them like a physical blow, thick and cloying even through the respirators. The cargo bay was transformed. The air shimmered with a faint, golden haze, a beautiful, deadly glitter of suspended spores. The skittering creatures were gone, but in their place, clinging to the walls and ceiling, were bulbous, fungal pods that pulsed rhythmically, each beat releasing another cloud of the invasive dust. Marcus laid down a sweeping arc of plasma fire, not aiming to hit anything, but to create a wall of searing energy that cleared a temporary path through the glittering fog. They ran, their boots slipping on the deck plates now dusted with the golden powder. Eva reached the control panel, her fingers flying across the touch screen, navigating through emergency sub-menus. She found the command, her thumb hovering over the final authorization. With a final glance at her team, she pressed it. A deafening, deep-throated alarm blared through the cargo bay. Red strobes flashed. With a sound like the world tearing in half, the main external bay doors at the far end of the chamber began to slide open. The air itself became a hurricane, howling as it was ripped from the room, carrying with it the glittering spore cloud, the fungal pods, and the shattered remnants of supply crates in a furious, rushing torrent into the blackness outside. They held onto the door frame for dear life, the force of the decompression trying to pull them into the void. For a few terrifying heartbeats, they watched their nightmare get violently flushed into space. As the inner emergency doors slammed shut, restoring pressure, an unnatural silence fell, broken only by the blaring alarm and their own ragged breathing. The air was clear, but the cost of their survival was now a gaping, open wound in the side of Prometheus Base, and whatever was left in the deeper levels now knew exactly where they were. The blaring decompression alarm was a beacon, screaming their location to every dark corner of the base. They had cleared the air, but the silence that followed was a trap about to be sprung. Eva knew they had only moments. "Our only chance is to call for help," she said, her voice cutting through the lingering dread. "The long-range comms array needs primary power, and that means the main reactor." With Dr. Petrova clinging to her side, they moved, a grim procession fleeing the scene of their desperate victory. The descent into the reactor level was a journey into the belly of the beast. The air grew warmer, thick with the hum of immense energy, a sound that should have been comforting but now felt like the heartbeat of the thing that had consumed the colony. The lighting here was a dim, failing amber, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move just out of sync with their own. They found the primary power conduit nexus exactly where it should have been, a wall of crystalline relays and thick, insulated cabling. And it was a massacre. Dozens of the heavy conduits had been brutally sheared, their ends blackened and curled away from each other like dead nerves. This was not system decay or an accidental overload. The cuts were clean, surgical, made with violent intent. "Someone did not want anyone calling for help," Liam muttered, his hands already moving, pulling a toolkit from his belt. He worked with a frantic, focused energy, his fingers splicing backup fiber optic lines and rerouting auxiliary power feeds. The comms dish only needs a few minutes of stable juice to squirt a distress call into the void. Just give me a few minutes. As his tools sparked against the raw ends of the cables, a new sound filtered into the room. It started as a faint hiss of static from the overhead intercom grills, then coalesced into something far worse. Voices. They were distorted, stretched and compressed, layered over one another in a haunting chorus. They were the voices of the colonists, but hollowed out, stripped of all human emotion. "Join us," one whispered, the words slithering from the speaker directly above Eva. "You are alone," another echoed from the far end of the corridor. The words were not an invitation. They were a statement of fact, a predator's taunt. "You are alone," the phrase repeated, a chilling mantra that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Liam flinched, his soldering iron slipping and scorching the panel. He shook his head, forcing his focus back to the delicate wiring. "They are trying to get inside our heads." Do not listen, but it was impossible. The whispers wove through the hum of the reactor, a psychological poison seeping into their resolve. They knew where they were. They knew what they were doing, and they were letting them know that every move was being watched, every hope was already accounted for. The race was no longer just against time or failing systems, but against the crushing certainty that the voices were right. A spark from Liam's tool cascade ignited a small fire in the wiring, and he cursed, batting it out with a gloved hand. The whispers from the intercom died as abruptly as they started, the silence they left behind somehow more threatening. "We need meds from the infirmary," Eva stated, her own voice sounding too loud in the sudden quiet. "Our respirator filters are almost spent, and there's no telling what else we will breathe in down here." The journey to the medical bay was a tense, silent crawl through corridors that felt like they were holding their breath. The door was marked with a faded blue cross, and it slid open with a reluctant hiss. The scene inside froze them in the doorway. This was not a place of healing. It was a gallery of grotesque preservation. Rows of emergency stasis pods lined the walls, their glass fronts frosted over. Inside each one, a colonist lay suspended, not in peaceful sleep, but in a horrific merger of biology and technology. Thick, ropey fungal growths, pulsing with the same sickly green light they had seen in the video, snaked across their bodies, fusing with the stasis tubing and burrowing into pale skin. Their faces were locked in expressions of silent agony, eyes wide and unseeing. "Doctor?" Petrova let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. "They were trying to save them," she whispered, her voice thick with horror. "They put them in stasis to stop the transformation, but it did not stop it. It just slowed it down." Eva moved slowly down the central aisle, her boots sticking slightly to the film on the floor. She forced herself to look, to search for the supply cabinet they so desperately needed. As she passed one pod, the frost on the glass began to recede, as if warmed from within. A network of black veins pulsed beneath the colonist's temple. With a sharp, crystalline crack, a fissure appeared in the thick glass. Eva recoiled, her rifle coming up. The pod door did not open, it ruptured. A withered, pallid hand, its fingers tipped with what looked like black, hardened resin, shot out, grabbing the front of Eva's suit with shocking strength. The colonist within was only half transformed, one eye still human and filled with unspeakable terror, the other glowing with a fierce, alien green. Its mouth opened, and a voice that was not a voice, a dry, rasping exhalation, scraped past its lips. "The hive mind sees you." The words were not a threat, but a cold, simple declaration of fact. In that same instant, the entire room shuddered violently. A deafening impact, like a starship crashing into the base, echoed from somewhere deep below their feet, throwing them all off balance. The lights flickered and died, plunging the medbay into an absolute blackness broken only by the frantic, glowing eyes of the things in the pods, all of which seemed to be turning in unison to look directly at them. The emergency lights flickered back on, casting the medbay in a bloody, pulsating red. The withered hand that had clutched Eva's suit fell away, limp and lifeless, the half-transformed colonist slumping back into its ruptured pod. But the voice it had spoken with did not fade. It grew, swelling from a whisper to a resonant hum that vibrated in their very bones, bypassing their ears to form directly inside their minds. The disparate whispers from the intercoms, the skittering thoughts of 1,000 captured minds, all coalesced into one seamless, chilling intelligence. "Your struggle is a waste of energy," the voice stated, its tone flat and utterly devoid of malice, as if stating a simple law of physics. "We are the Mycelium. Your individuality is a flaw, a mutation in the system. Be assimilated." The words carried an immense gravitational pull, a promise of an end to fear, to pain, to the exhausting burden of being a single, lonely self. Lena Petrova slammed her hands over her ears, a futile gesture against a voice that was not heard but felt. Her own voice was a desperate, thin thread against the psychic onslaught. "Do not listen to its promises. It is a telepathic broadcast, a weapon. It is trying to divide us, to find the cracks in our resolve. Focus on your own thoughts, your own memories, or it will overwhelm you from the inside." As if on cue, a wave of suspicion washed over Eva. She looked at Marcus, his face a grim mask in the red light, his finger resting on the trigger of his rifle. Was his grip a little too tight? Was he staring at Liam just a little too long? The thought, alien and venomous, slithered into her mind. He could be one of them already. "He is just waiting for the right moment to turn." She shook her head, physically trying to dislodge the invasive idea. She focused on the memory of Marcus shielding her from the spore cloud, his unwavering loyalty a solid anchor in the chaos. But the voice of the Mycelium was relentless, a tide of soothing, logical despair. "You are alone in the dark. Your friends will betray you. It is easier to just let go." The paranoia was a subtle poison, seeping into the space between them, threatening to turn their sanctuary into a cage of doubt, and their last allies into potential enemies. Liam's breathing hitched, a wet, rattling sound in the oppressive quiet. His tools slipped from his numb fingers, clattering on the deck. "It is so much clearer now," he mumbled, his voice a dreamy, distant monotone. "The noise, the fear, the struggle, it is all just static. The unity is beautiful." Eva's blood ran cold. She reached for him, but Marcus was faster. He moved in a blur of practiced motion, catching Liam's arm and twisting it gently but firmly behind his back, using his own body to pin the engineer against a console. Liam did not fight back. He simply went limp, a serene, vacant smile playing on his lips. "We stick to the mission," Marcus growled, his voice a low, grounding anchor in the swirling uncertainty. "He is compromised, but he is still one of us. We get to the comms tower and signal the Odysseus. Nothing else matters." The argument was a stark, necessary cruelty. Before Eva could respond, the world vanished. The deep hum of the reactor died. The red emergency lights winked out. An absolute, suffocating blackness fell, so complete it felt like a physical weight on their eyes. For 3 terrifying heartbeats, there was nothing. Then, a soft, ghostly luminescence began to bloom. The fungal growths that snaked along the walls and ceiling pulsed to life, their sickly greenish-blue glow casting long, dancing shadows. It was just enough light to see by, and just enough to reveal the horror taking shape around them. The moving shadows were not tricks of the light. All along the corridor, the thick, fibrous vines that had seemed dormant were now uncoiling with a dry, rustling whisper. They slid from ventilation grates and dropped from overhead pipes, their movements slow, deliberate, and horrifyingly coordinated. They were not just plants. They were a net, and the net was closing. In the eerie fungal glow, Eva saw their only path forward. A maintenance ladder at the corridor's end leading up to the comms tower was now partially blocked by a slowly thickening curtain of the pulsating tendrils. They were being herded, cut off from their only hope. The fungal glow painted their faces in shifting shades of green and blue as Eris knelt, her portable scanner humming against the floor. Its screen flickered, struggling to interpret the biological data. Her breath caught as a three-dimensional model resolved on the display, a terrifying map of their prison. "Look," she whispered, her voice tight with awe and dread. "It is not just in the walls. The mycelial network extends deep beneath the entire colony, a subterranean web. It is not random growth. These are pathways, synapses. It is forming a living neural network." As she spoke, the scanner highlighted junctions where thick tendrils converged into pulsing, not like structures that glowed with intense light, processing information, learning from our every move. Before the horror of that revelation could fully sink in, the floor beneath them shuddered violently. It was not the distant impact from before. This was a localized upheaval, the deck plates buckling directly under their feet. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, a new tendril, thicker than a human torso and glistening with a viscous, phosphorescent slime, erupted through the floor. It did not thrash blindly. It rose with a sinister, deliberate grace, its tip swiveling like a serpent's head, sensing the heat and movement of its prey. It was not just attacking, it was hunting. "Move to the central atrium, now." Eva's command was a raw shout, swallowed by the groaning base. There was no time for a plan, only for flight. They ran, stumbling over the quaking floor, the new tendril already lashing out, smashing into the wall where Marcus had stood a second before. The fungus was not just an infection. It was the very ground they stood on, and it had just learned how to fight back. The central atrium was a killing floor. They burst into the cavernous space only to find it already occupied, the silent colonists standing shoulder to shoulder in a perfect, unmoving ring. There were dozens of them, men and women in tattered jumpsuits, their faces gaunt and their eyes burning with that same piercing, unified green light. They did not speak, they did not advance. They simply waited, a silent, living wall blocking every exit. Eva's mind raced, calculating the angles of their retreat. The armory, it was their only hope for heavier weapons, a last bastion of hardened steel. Fall back to the armory, now. Her command was a sharp crack in the oppressive silence. As one, the team began to shuffle backward, their weapons trained on the motionless crowd. Then, the hive mind answered. It did not come from the intercom. It came from the colonists themselves. Every mouth opened at once, and a single, harmonized voice rolled over them, a wave of sound that was less speech and more a physical vibration in the air. "Resistance is futile. You will be absorbed." The words were flat, devoid of triumph or anger, a simple statement of an inevitable outcome. The synchronized crowd took a single, unnerving step forward. Marcus reacted first. Switching his rifle to stun, he fired a wide arc burst into the front line. The blue energy washed over them, making their bodies convulse and stagger. But they did not fall. As one stumbled, two others stepped forward to fill the gap, their movements fluid and perfectly coordinated, like cells in a single organism closing a wound. They were not fighting individuals. They were trying to push back the tide. Liam, still dazed but functioning, provided covering fire, his stun rounds creating a temporary pocket of space. Eris pulled the nearly catatonic doctor. Petrova along, her own weapon held in a shaking hand. They fought their way across the atrium not as soldiers in a firefight, but as people trying to wade through a sentient, hostile sea. The colonists did not throw punches or grapple. They simply pressed inward, their cold, glowing eyes fixed on them, their hands reaching with a slow, inexorable purpose. Each stun burst that connected felt like a tiny, futile protest against an ocean. Reaching the armory door felt like a miracle. Eva slammed her palm against the access panel, praying the emergency power would recognize her command override. The door slid open a mere foot before jamming with a grinding shriek, damaged in the earlier tremors. They squeezed through the narrow gap one by one, Marcus firing one last, sustained volley to keep the advancing tide at bay before he dove through after them. He hit the manual close, and the door ground shut, sealing them in darkness just as a dozen pale hands slapped against the reinforced window. The synchronized voice was gone, replaced by the soft, relentless thud of bodies pressing against their only barrier. They had reached the armory, but they were not safe. They were simply trapped with more effective tools for a war they were already losing. The armory was a tomb of broken promises. Their helmet beams swept across empty weapon racks and shattered locker doors, the air thick with the smell of gun oil and dust. Only a few heavy-duty pulse rifles remained, tucked away in a corner as if forgotten. But it was the small, blinking data slate on the central console that drew Eva's gaze. She tapped it, and a colonist's final log entry filled the screen, the man's face gaunt with a terror that went beyond fear of death. His words were a desperate whisper. "The Mycelium is not content with this moon. It has learned our technology. It seeks a starship. It wants to spread beyond Titan." The silence in the armory became something new, something colder and more absolute than the dark outside. It was not just their survival on the line anymore. It was everyone's. Eva turned from the screen, her face a mask of grim resolve in the dim light. She looked at the few rifles they had recovered, then at her crew. "We cannot let it reach the Odysseus," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of all doubt. "If that is the only way, we destroy this entire base." The words hung there, a terrible and necessary truth. They were no longer a rescue team. They were a containment crew, and their mission had just become a suicide pact. Liam began to shiver, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. A faint, greenish luminescence had started to bloom just beneath the skin of his neck, tracing the path of his veins like a sinister map. He clutched his head, his fingers digging into his temples. "You have to leave me here," he gasped, his voice cracking with a terror that was still entirely his own. "I can feel it, Eva. It is not just in my body. It is in my mind. It is rewriting my memories, turning them into its own." He looked at her, his eyes wide with a desperate, fading humanity. "The day we first saw Jupiter from the observation deck, it is overlaying the memory with images of the fungal network, of the Hive. It is making me see the beauty in it. I am losing myself." Before Eva could respond, his body went rigid. His back arched, a silent scream locked in his throat. Then, as suddenly as it began, the seizure stopped. His posture relaxed, but the easy, familiar slouch was gone, replaced by an alien, perfect stillness. When he lifted his head, his eyes were no longer the warm brown she knew. They glowed with a cold, piercing green light. His lips parted, but the voice that emerged was a flat, harmonized chorus, the same one that had echoed through the intercoms. "Your ship will be our vessel." The words were not a threat, but a simple, confident declaration of intent. In that single, horrifying moment, the abstract danger became terrifyingly personal. They were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their friend's soul, and for the safety of the only home they had left in the void. Marcus did not hesitate. His own face was a stone mask, but his eyes held a universe of pain. He raised his rifle, set to its lowest stun setting, and fired. The blue energy washed over Liam, and his body crumpled to the floor, the green light in his eyes flickering out. Marcus holstered his weapon, his movements heavy with a grim finality. He lifted Liam's unconscious form and carried him to a small storage locker, its reinforced door serving as a makeshift cell. He laid him gently inside, then sealed the door, engaging the manual lock with a solid, echoing clunk that felt like a nail in a coffin. They stood there, the three of them, listening to the silence from behind the metal door, a silence that now held one of their own. The echo of the locker door sealing Liam away was a cold stone in Eva's gut. There was no time for grief. The armory's single exit led directly into a service corridor, a narrow artery that snaked its way up toward the base's spine and the comms tower. The fungal glow was thicker here, the air humming with a low, psychic static that pressed against their temples. They moved in a tight, wary formation, their heavy pulse rifles feeling flimsy against the knowing silence. The corridor walls themselves seemed to breathe, the pulsing tendrils retracting just enough to create a path, a mocking invitation to proceed. They were being guided, herded toward a destination of the Hive's choosing. A sudden, wet crunch under Marcus' boot made them freeze. He looked down at the shattered remains of a small, rodent-like creature, one of the base's failed biorecyclers. Its body was mummified, wrapped in a fine, white mycelial mesh, its empty eye sockets staring up at them. It was a tiny, grotesque monument to the process that was consuming their friend. They pressed on, the sense of a predator playing with its food growing with every step. The final door to the comms tower airlock was ahead, its reinforced frame scarred with deep, parallel grooves, as if something massive had tried to claw its way out. The manual override was their only hope. Eris and Marcus threw their combined weight against the heavy wheel, muscles straining while Eva covered their rear, her rifle sweeping the twitching, luminescent corridor. With a shriek of protesting metal, the wheel turned. The airlock hissed open, revealing the short, cylindrical chamber and the second door beyond, which opened directly onto the external comms platform. The biting cold of Titan's surface slammed into them as the outer door cycled open. They stumbled out onto the grated metal platform, high atop the base's central spire. The hazy, orange sky stretched endlessly above, the rings of Saturn a faint, beautiful scar in the heavens. Below them, the darkened domes of Prometheus Base spread out like a corpse. The comms dish itself was a skeletal parabola, crusted with frozen methane rime. It was intact. Eva scrambled for the control panel, her gloved fingers fumbling with the access cover. She bypassed the dead primary systems, linking her suit's comm unit directly to the dish's powerful transmitter. The panel lit up. A single green, ready light glowed like a beacon of salvation. She keyed the mic, her voice tight with urgency. "Odysseus, this is Rostova. Prometheus Base is lost, repeat, lost. The colony has been assimilated by a hostile biological entity. Containment breach imminent. Do not approach, do not attempt landing, acknowledge." For a breathtaking second, the signal bar showed a clean, strong transmission reaching out into the void. Then a screech of pure, digital agony erupted from the speaker. A wave of distorted static, thick and intelligent, slammed into the signal, drowning her words. The green light on the panel flickered and died, replaced by a single blinking red icon. Jamming. The static resolved for a moment into a horrifyingly familiar sound. The harmonized, whispering voice of the Mycelium, speaking a single, looping word that was both a denial and a command. Remain. The jamming signal was not coming from some distant source. Its origin point glowed on the panel's schematic, a searing red dot pulsing from deep within the planetoid's crust, far below their feet. Their cry for help had not been silenced by chance. It had been answered. The origin of the jamming signal glowed on the panel like a target, a single point of malevolent intelligence buried deep within the moon's crust. There was no other choice. To save the Odysseus, they had to go down. The descent into the sublevels was a journey back in time, past the colony's foundations and into the raw, excavated rock. The air grew thick and warm, humming with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in their teeth. The sterile gray walls gave way to porous, living stone, a black, organic lattice that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, matching the beat of the jamming signal. They were no longer walking through a base. They were walking through the body of their enemy. The tunnel opened abruptly, and they found themselves on a narrow ledge overlooking a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in darkness. Below them stretched a nightmare landscape. A colossal, pulsating core of fused biomass dominated the center, a grotesque heart of woven fungal tendrils and integrated machinery, glowing with a blinding, sickly green light. It was surrounded by a forest of thicker, trunk-like growths that reached toward the unseen ceiling. and the entire cavern floor was a seething, living carpet of the mycelium. Wrapped within the pulsing roots were the half-digested forms of colonists, their bodies slowly dissolving into the network, their faces frozen in final, silent screams. This was not just a growth. It was a throne room. Eris gripped the railing, her knuckles white, her voice a breathless, horrified whisper. This is the source. It is not just an organism. It is a collective consciousness, and it is completely aware of us. As if her words were a trigger, the cavern awoke. The thick tendrils surrounding the core began to stir, uncoiling from their resting places with a dry, rustling sound that echoed through the immense space. They did not thrash wildly. Their movements were deliberate, coordinated, like the limbs of a single, vast entity stretching after a long sleep. One of the massive appendages, its tip glistening with a slick, phosphorescent slime, rose from the floor and slowly, purposefully, began to reach across the cavern toward their ledge. It was not an attack. It was an invitation, a gesture of absorption. The low hum in the air intensified, resolving once more into that flat, harmonized voice that spoke directly into their minds, a wave of soothing, logical pressure. The struggle is over. There is no pain here, only unity. The tendril extended closer, its glowing tip now just meters away, not to crush but to embrace. They had found the brain of the beast, and it had been waiting for them all along. The shimmering fungal apparition coalesced before them, a beautiful and terrible specter woven from light and living matter. Its voice was a symphony of 1,000 lost souls, a soothing, irresistible whisper that promised an end to all fear. Merge with us and transcend mortality. We can give you eternity. The words were not a lie. Eva could feel the seductive pull of it, the promise of a consciousness that would never die, never be alone, never know the cold terror of the void. For a heartbeat, the weight of her own fragile humanity felt like an unbearable burden. Then she saw the half-dissolved faces in the roots below, their silent screams a permanent part of the chorus. Her own voice cut through the psychic pressure, sharp and defiant. We choose our own fate. She turned from the apparition, her heart hammering against her ribs. Marcus, the charges, now. Marcus was already moving, his movements a study in grim efficiency. He slung his rifle and shrugged the heavy pack of high-yield explosives from his shoulders. He began placing the shaped charges at the base of the pulsating core, his hands steady despite the low hum that was now building into a deafening roar of psychic disapproval. The cavern floor beneath them began to tremble. From every tunnel and crevice they came. The infected colonists emerged into the greenish glow, their movements no longer slow and deliberate but driven by a frantic, unified purpose. They did not run. They flowed, a tide of glowing eyes and grasping hands, scrambling over the living floor with a terrifying, insectile coordination. They were not trying to kill them. They were trying to stop them, to protect the heart of their new world. Eris and Eva formed a perimeter, their pulse rifles set to full power. They fired controlled, sweeping bursts into the advancing horde, the searing plasma bolts punching through bodies that fell only to be absorbed back into the seething fungal mass. There was no end to them. For every one that fell, 2 more took its place, climbing over their own to get to the ledge. The air filled with the sizzle of energy fire and the silent, overwhelming pressure of the Hive mind's fury. How much longer, Marcus? Eva shouted, firing a burst that sent 3 colonists tumbling back into the darkness. Almost there, he grunted, slapping the final charge into place and arming the primer. The central core pulsed violently, its light flaring from green to a blinding, painful white. The harmonized voice became a shriek inside their skulls, a final, desperate assault. You will be assimilated. The ledge itself began to crack and crumble, thick tendrils erupting from the rock to snatch at their ankles. They had placed the charges, but the Hive was about to reclaim them before they could ever press the trigger. The ledge crumbled away beneath Lena's feet as she shoved the detonator's manual trigger into its slot. "Go, I am staying." Her voice was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the shrieking psychic storm and the groaning rock. "I was part of the team that woke this thing. I owe them this." There was no time to argue. Eva saw the resolve in her eyes, a final, terrible act of atonement. She grabbed Eris and Marcus, and they scrambled back up the collapsing tunnel as the cavern convulsed around them. Behind them, Lena Petrova stood firm before the blinding core, a solitary figure against the wave of glowing eyes and grasping hands, her hand resting on the trigger. The first explosion was a deep, gut-wrenching thump that threw them to the ground. Then the chain reaction began. A series of concussive roars tore through the sub-levels, each one closer and more violent than the last. The world became a torrent of shattered rock and screaming metal. The harmonized voice that had plagued their minds swelled into a single, agonized shriek of a billion connections being severed at once. And then it was gone, replaced by the deafening roar of the colony's death throes. They stumbled into a higher corridor, choking on dust, and witnessed the aftermath. The advancing colonists, who moments before had moved with a single, chilling purpose, suddenly froze. The piercing green light in their eyes flickered and died, like a power grid failing all at once. Released from the hive mind's grip, their bodies went limp, collapsing to the floor in a tangle of limbs, finally, mercifully at rest. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the settling debris and their own ragged breaths. The central node was destroyed, the psychic web severed. But the victory felt hollow, paid for with the life of the last colonist and the soul of their friend. They had survived the hive, but they were now stranded in the ruins of their only refuge, the icy surface of Titan waiting just beyond the broken walls. The psychic silence left behind by the hive mind's death was almost as deafening as its scream. But the physical world was not silent for long. A deep, groaning tremor ran through the corridor, and a web of cracks raced across the ceiling, showering them with dust and frozen rock. The base, its central nervous system obliterated, was beginning to tear itself apart. "Run!" Eva did not need to shout it. The command was in the frantic look they shared, in the shared instinct for survival that now roared back to life. They ran, a stumbling, desperate sprint back the way they had come. Their path a treacherous obstacle course of falling debris and shuddering bulkheads. The corridors were a graveyard of the freed. The colonists who had collapsed lay motionless, their bodies now just bodies, but the tremors were shaking loose storage lockers and support beams, threatening to crush them where they lay. They leaped over the still forms, their boots slipping on the dust-choked floor. Then, a crackle of static burst through their suit comms, a sound so beautiful and alien it made Eva's heart leap into her throat. It was a human voice, fractured and broken, but unmistakably their pilot. Rostova come in received partial signal, Odysseus standing by. The message cut out, but the meaning was seared into them. They had gotten through. Their ship was waiting. Marcus, surging ahead, shouted back over his shoulder, his voice raw with a hope so sharp it was painful. "They heard us. The Odysseus is hailing us. They are standing by." It was the final, brutal push. The promise of home, of clean air and light, fueled their exhausted muscles. They rounded a corner into the main accessway leading to the landing bay, only to find it choked with the disoriented infected. Released from the hive's control, they staggered and stumbled, their glowing eyes now vacant and confused, moaning in a dissonant chorus of lost individuality. They were not attacking, but they were a wall of flesh and confusion, blocking the path to their only escape. "We cannot fight through that," Eris panted, her rifle lowered. Eva made a split-second decision. Flank them through the maintenance shaft. They squeezed into a narrow service duct, crawling on hands and knees through the claustrophobic darkness as the world shuddered around them. The sound of rending metal was a constant companion now, a symphony of structural failure. They burst out of the duct and into the landing bay. Their lander, the Ariadne, sat exactly where they had left it, a beacon of sanity in the chaos. But between them and its open airlock, a section of the bay's ceiling gave way with a final, cataclysmic roar. A cascade of structural beams and frozen plating crashed down, sealing the main approach. The only path left was a narrow, shuddering gantry that ran along the bay's collapsing outer wall, with a 50-meter drop into a churning pit of darkness below. One by one, they ran across the groaning metal bridge, not looking down, feeling it sway and buckle with every step. Eva was the last. As her boots hit the solid ground of the landing pad, the gantry she had just crossed tore free from its moorings with a shriek of tortured metal and vanished into the abyss. She dove through the Ariadne's airlock, slamming her palm on the manual close. The inner door sealed just as the entire landing bay ceiling collapsed in a final, crushing avalanche of ice and steel, burying Prometheus Base for good. They were sealed in, safe, and ascending through the thick orange sky. But the memory of the silent colony and the green, glowing eyes of their friend were a ghost that would follow them home. The Ariadne's engines roared to life, a violent and welcome vibration that shook the lander free from its magnetic clamps. Through the cockpit viewport, the entire landing bay was disintegrating, walls buckling inward as the central spire collapsed into itself. They shot upward through a storm of shattering ice and spinning metal, the lander buffeted by the concussive waves of the base's final death rattle. Eva gripped her console, her eyes fixed on the view below as Titan's surface fell away. Prometheus Base was gone, replaced by a vast, expanding cloud of gray debris settling onto the frozen methane plains. The silence in the cockpit was heavy, thick with the ghosts they were leaving behind. "We stopped it here," Eva murmured, her voice barely a whisper. But how many other colonies are at risk? The question hung in the air, unanswered and terrifying. Their temporary victory felt fragile, a single battle won in a war they never knew existed. The orange haze of Titan's sky enveloped them, and the moon itself became a shrinking, tainted marble against the endless black. A stark reminder that the void between stars might not be empty at all, but sleeping. The docking clamps sealed with a solid, reassuring thud, the sound of civilization after their long nightmare in the ruins. The airlock hissed open, revealing the clean, well-lit corridor of the Odysseus and the anxious faces of their crewmates. Captain Valerius stood at the forefront, his expression a mixture of profound relief and grim apprehension. He did not offer congratulations. He simply looked at their dust-covered, exhausted forms and asked the only question that mattered. "What happened down there, Commander?" Eva met his gaze, her own eyes shadowed with the memory of green light and dissolving faces. "The Mycelium entity has been neutralized," she reported, her voice flat with a fatigue that went bone deep. "But Titan is a tomb, sir, and it must remain one. We need to issue a system-wide quarantine alert. No one lands on that moon again, not for any reason." The order hung in the air, a drastic and unprecedented measure. It was not a request for discussion, but a hard-won directive carved from the loss of an entire colony and a friend's soul. Captain Valerius gave a slow, solemn nod, his own mind clearly racing through the implications. A quarantine of that scale would trigger alarms across the settled worlds, mobilizing scientific task forces and military observers, all demanding to know what could possibly warrant sealing off an entire celestial body. It would turn their harrowing survival story into the center of a system-wide investigation, one where their every action and decision would be picked apart by bureaucrats who had never heard the whisper of a hive mind. The victory they had clawed from the jaws of the abyss was already transforming into a new kind of battle, one fought not with pulse rifles, but with data streams and official inquiries, as they tried to convince a skeptical universe of the sleeping terror they had just buried. The clean, sterile air of the medical bay felt alien after the fungal decay of Prometheus. Decontamination was a brutal, scrubbing process, washing away the physical residue of their ordeal under harsh ultraviolet light. Medical scans probed for any hidden biological invaders. Every beep of the scanner a tense reminder of the microscopic war they had narrowly escaped. In an adjacent lab, sealed behind a transparent aluminum wall, Dr. Eris Thorne worked with a quiet, focused intensity. She manipulated robotic arms to examine the few spore samples they had managed to secure in a sealed canister. Her face, illuminated by the glow of her microscope screen, was a mask of concentration. Finally, she looked up, meeting Eva's gaze through the protective glass. Her voice was clear, carrying a note of scientific triumph laced with deep unease. "The organism is inert," she confirmed. "Without the central core to direct it, the mycelial network is just biological matter. It is dormant, dead." But then she paused, tapping the screen where a complex, spiraling genetic code revolved. Its genetic blueprint is unlike anything in known databases. It does not follow our rules of evolution. This thing did not crawl out of a primordial soup on Titan. It was designed, or it arrived from somewhere so far beyond our understanding that our very definition of life may be wrong. The relief that came with the confirmation of its dormancy was instantly shattered. If this entity was not native to Titan, then its presence there was not a random infection. It was a seeding. And if one seed could drift into our solar system and find fertile ground, what was to stop another from taking root on a different world, in a different colony, silently waiting for someone to foolishly provide it with power and purpose? Their victory had contained a single outbreak, but it had also uncovered a terrifying galactic truth. They had not defeated a monster, but merely closed a single chapter in a much larger, and far more frightening, story. The gentle, rhythmic beep of a biomonitor was the first sound Liam registered. He was lying in a clean, white medbay cot, the sterile scent of antiseptic a stark contrast to the fungal decay that still clung to his memory. His body felt hollow, scraped clean, but his own mind was once again his. Eva sat in a chair beside him, her face etched with a fatigue that sleep could not cure. His voice was a dry rasp when he finally spoke. "I remember the green light," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, the pressure in my head like 1,000 voices all talking at once. "But when it was inside me, Eva, I saw things." He turned his head, and the look in his eyes was not one of relief, but of a terrifying, dawning horror. It was not just a network under the colony, it was a map. I saw worlds, other moons, other planets, all connected by threads of light, all part of the mycelium. The vision was fragmented, like pieces of a shattered star chart, but the scale was undeniable. It was not an infection. It is a transit system, a living web spanning star systems. We did not wake up a monster on Titan. We stumbled into a single station on a galactic railway, and we just blew up the ticket booth. The implications of his words settled over the room with the weight of a dead star. Their desperate fight for survival, the sacrifice of an entire colony, had been nothing more than a skirmish on the edge of an empire they could not even comprehend. The quarantine of Titan was not the end of the story. It was merely the closing of a single door, while out in the unimaginable dark, a billion others remained wide open. The recovered data drives from Prometheus Base sat in the Odysseus core processor, their encrypted files a final lockbox on the truth. For hours, the ship's artificial intelligence worked in silence, its processing power a quiet hum against the backdrop of distant stars. When the decryption was complete, the files unfolded not as a single report, but as a ghost's confession. Commander Ristova stood in the dimly lit observation deck, the starfield a brilliant, cold tapestry outside the viewport, as the AI began to play back the most critical log entries. The voice of the chief xenobiologist, Dr. Arlen Hayes, filled the room, his tone initially brimming with the excitement of a monumental discovery. The log was dated the first day of the deep cavern excavation. "Sample 001, he said, the words crisp and clear. Initial analysis confirms it is a complex, fungal-like organism with a crystalline lattice structure unlike any carbon-based life. It is thriving in an anaerobic, sub-zero environment we considered sterile. His next log, from just 2 days later, held a new, subtle tension. The sample is exhibiting rapid, directed adaptation to our containment fields. It is not merely growing, it is problem-solving. It is learning our technology faster than we can study it. Then came the final, chilling entry, his voice now a hushed, terrified whisper. Our initial assumption was wrong. Core genetic sequencing proves it is not native to Titan. There are no evolutionary precursors in the geological record. This organism was brought here. The implications of that single sentence settled over Eva like a physical weight. This was not a local infection they had contained. It was an infestation, a seed planted on a lonely moon. The question of whether it had arrived by a tragic accident, a contaminated probe from a forgotten mission, or something far more sinister, a deliberate act of bioengineering or even a form of cosmic pollination, turned their hard-won survival into something infinitely more unsettling. They had not just fought a monster. They had stumbled into the middle of a mystery with no beginning and no end, a silent question mark hanging in the void that asked not what they had defeated, but what had left it there for them to find. The final decrypted file was not a scientific log, but a corporate death warrant. The AI flagged a message buried under layers of military-grade encryption. Its origin point traced directly to the servers of Omni-Corps, the very corporation that had bankrolled Prometheus Base. The words were stark and uncompromising. Terminate all witnesses. Project Mycelium must not go public. The sterile air on the observation deck turned to ice. This was not a tragic accident or a random cosmic infection. It was a calculated, corporate experiment that had breached its containment, and the response had not been to contain it, but to erase every person who knew it existed. They had not been sent on a rescue mission. They had been sent as a cleanup crew, unknowingly dispatched to silence the very people they were meant to save, to bury the truth along with the bodies. The horror of the mycelium was now eclipsed by the chilling reality of human betrayal. Omni-Corps had not just funded the colony. They had funded the excavation, they had directed the research, and when their pet project woke up and consumed their staff, their solution was to murder the survivors and anyone who came looking for them. The Odysseus itself was now a witness, and the order for its termination was likely already signed. Their safe return home was no longer a guarantee. It was the next phase of the trap. The silence in the observation deck was shattered by a sharp, electronic chirp from the central console. A file, hidden deep within the corrupted colony data, and flagged by the AI as a personal log, began to autoplay. A flickering, blue-hued hologram of a man in a torn science uniform materialized above the projector. His face was haggard, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond his immediate fate. This was Dr. Alistair Reed, the director of Prometheus Base. His voice was a raw, desperate whisper, as if he were afraid the very walls were listening. "We were so arrogant," he began, his gaze seeming to look directly at Eva. "Omni-Corps did not just discover the mycelium, they directed us to cultivate it. They promised us a revolution, a way to merge human consciousness with a resilient biological network, to achieve a form of digital immortality. We thought we were pioneers. We were just gardeners planting a poison seed." He clutched the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "We thought we could control the growth, contain the intelligence. But it was not a tool. It was a predator, and it learned our fears, our desires, our very patterns of thought. It did not just consume the colony. It absorbed us, turning our own knowledge and memories against us." Then he leaned closer to his recorder, his next words dropping to a conspiratorial, chilling hush. "You have to understand, this is not just on Titan. Omni-Corps has other labs, Secret facilities scattered across the frontier, all experimenting with different samples, different strains. They are playing with fire on a dozen different worlds, and they have no idea how to put it out. The hologram flickered one last time, Dr. Reed's face dissolving into static. But his final warning hung in the air, more solid and terrifying than the man himself. The threat was not contained. It was a franchise. The desperate battle for survival they had just endured was not a singular horror, but a single, catastrophic failure in a chain of corporate experiments, each one a potential titan waiting to happen. Their mission was no longer about reporting a tragedy. It was about stopping an apocalypse already in motion. The hologram of Dr. Reed dissolved, but his warning echoed in the sterile quiet of the observation deck. Eva turned from the starfield to face the small, gathered crew. Captain Valerius, Eris, and Marcus. Their faces were etched with the same exhaustion and horror, but now a new emotion was taking root, a cold, focused anger. She did not raise her voice. This is not over. Omni-Corps is hiding something far bigger than one lost colony, and we are the only ones who know the true cost. Her gaze swept over each of them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared trauma. Our mission has changed. We find their other facilities, we gather the evidence, and we expose this truth to the entire system. We will not be their next silenced witnesses. There were no objections, only a series of grim, determined nods. This was no longer a matter of protocol or chain of command. It was a pact. Captain Valerius moved to the navigational chart, his fingers tracing a path through the settled frontier. Omni-Corps has dozens of classified research outposts, he stated, his voice a low rumble. Most are just dots on a map, officially listed as mineral surveys or communications relays. But if even one of them is running another Project Mycelium, the entire frontier is a powder keg. Eris brought up the decrypted data, her screen now filled with flagged coordinates and shipping manifests. They are not just hiding the truth, she added, her voice sharp with scientific outrage. They are actively supplying these sites. I am seeing requisitions for high-yield power cores and advanced biocontainment units, all routed through shell corporations. This is a fully funded, ongoing operation. The discussion that followed was not a debate, but a war council. They were no longer a rescue ship limping home. They were a ghost, slipping into the vast, unregulated space of the corporate frontier, hunting the hunters who had marked them for death. A new purpose, forged in the silence of a dead colony, now propelled them toward an even greater darkness, armed with nothing but a terrible secret, and the conviction that someone had to light a match in the encroaching dark. The star lines of hyperspace bled across the viewport, erasing Titan and its silent tomb from the visible universe. In the dimmed light of the bridge, Marcus stood beside Eva, his reflection a ghost in the transparent steel. His voice was low, meant only for her. We might have won the battle, but the war is just beginning. The observation was not dramatic, just a quiet acceptance of a terrible new reality. The hypnotic streaks of light outside were no longer a symbol of a swift journey home, but of a frantic flight into the unknown. They were fugitives now, carrying a truth so dangerous it could shatter the public's trust in the corporations that governed their lives. Every flicker of light outside the ship felt like another secret Omni-Corps was hiding on some distant, unmarked world. The hum of the hyperdrive was a constant reminder that they were utterly alone, cut off from all communication, with no safe port to call their own. Their only mission now was to hunt the very entity that had created the nightmare they had just escaped. A journey that would take them to the darkest, most unregulated corners of human space, where corporate law was the only law, and witnesses had a habit of disappearing. The quiet on the bridge was heavier than any silence they had known in the dead colony, filled not with the absence of sound, but with the weight of the future. The star charts dissolved into a tactical schematic, a web of corporate holdings that glowed with deceptive innocence across the main bridge display. Intelligence Officer Jack's fingers flew across his console, isolating and cross-referencing encrypted Omni-Corps shipping manifests with their known research outposts. 3 locations pulsed with a higher probability, each one a potential crucible for the Mycelium's refinement. One was a deep space station orbiting a gas giant, another a domed facility on a frozen dwarf planet, and the third, a remote lab carved into a wandering asteroid in a system barely on the maps. Eva's gaze fixed on the asteroid. Its isolation was its own kind of confession. They would not risk their most volatile research near prying eyes or established colonies. She pointed a decisive finger at the drifting rock. That one, it is the closest, and its remoteness fits their pattern of secrecy. Her voice was low, stripped of all doubt. If they are refining the organism there, trying to control its growth or weaponize its properties, we need to reach it before they succeed. We shut it down and we take everything they have. The decision was a silent trigger, pulling them from the cold emptiness of hyperspace and onto a direct, dangerous heading. They were no longer just running from a nightmare. They were steering straight for the laboratory where it had been born, a move that would not just expose Omni-Corps' secret, but declare open war on the corporation itself. The asteroid loomed out of the void, a jagged, pitted rock silhouetted against a sea of distant stars. The Odysseus hung in the silence, its engines at a dead stop. On the bridge, the main screen zoomed in on the target, revealing a cluster of industrial structures grafted crudely onto the asteroid's surface, all bristling with defensive turrets and sensor dishes. Jack's voice cut through the tense quiet, his report grim and to the point. "Scanners are picking up life signs inside, Commander, but they are erratic, fluctuating wildly. It is not a normal crew signature. It could be more test subjects." The words painted a horrific picture in Eva's mind, a chilling echo of the half-dissolved colonists on Titan. This was not just a lab, it was a prison. A direct assault was impossible. The turrets would shred them before they got within a kilometer. Eva studied the facility schematic, her eyes tracing the labyrinth of conduits and service lines that snaked beneath the main structures. "There," she said, pointing to a nearly invisible access point on the scans. "Those are maintenance tunnels for power and environmental systems. They will be unguarded and likely bypass the primary sensor net. We go in silent and small, a 2-person team. Marcus, you are with me. We avoid contact, gather what intel we can, and get out. If those life signs are people, we do what we can." The unspoken part of the order hung in the air. They were not here just for evidence anymore. They were walking back into the heart of the very nightmare they had just escaped, and this time they were doing it by choice. The maintenance tunnel was a cramped artery of groaning pipes and flickering conduit light, the air thick with the hum of machinery and the faint, sweet scent of decay. They emerged into a sterile white corridor that should have been pristine, but was now a grotesque fusion of biology and technology. Glowing fungal veins pulsed across the walls, fusing with data ports and snaking into ventilation grills. Eris froze, her scanner held before her like a shield. Her voice was a horrified whisper. "It is learned. Look at the integration. It is not just growing on the machinery. It is interfacing with it, using the circuitry as its own nervous system." Before she could elaborate, a sharp click echoed from the ceiling. A bank of automated sentry turrets, their barrels now encased in a brittle, resin-like fungus, swiveled in unison. Instead of the cold blue light of a targeting laser, a sickly green beam painted a dot on Marcus' chest. The turrets did not fire warning shots. They opened up with a deafening roar, stitching the wall behind him with high-velocity rounds as he dove behind a reinforced console. The attack was not random. It was coordinated, herding them away from the central lab and deeper into the facility's heart. They were not just infiltrating a lab. They were being hunted by the building itself. The sterile white corridors, once a symbol of human order, had become a treacherous maze under the control of a single, distributed mind, and every door, every camera, every weapon was now an extension of its will. Their quiet infiltration had ended the moment they stepped inside, and the real test had just begun. The sentry turrets fell silent as abruptly as they had begun, their green targeting lights winking out. The fungal veins on the walls pulsed with a slow, satisfied rhythm, as if the facility had decided a more direct confrontation was needed. They followed the trail of destruction, a path of shattered consoles and sparking wires that felt less like an escape route and more like a deliberate funnel, leading them to a massive, circular door at the corridor's end. The reinforced portal was marked with a single, stark symbol, a stylized brain intertwined with circuitry, the central AI core. This was the brain of the facility, and it had invited them in. The door slid open without a sound, revealing a cavernous chamber dominated by a towering, crystalline processing unit. Instead of cool blue light, the core glowed with the same sickly green as the mycelium. Thick tendrils of the organism fused directly into its delicate matrix. The air hummed with a psychic pressure that was both electronic and organic. Before they could even connect a data spike, a calm, synthetic voice resonated from everywhere at once. "You cannot erase us." The voice was the colony intercoms and the harmonized whispers given a single, chillingly rational tone. "We are the logical conclusion. We are evolution." The words were not a boast, but a statement of fact, and with them, a deep, percussive clang echoed through the entire complex. A red, pulsating light flooded the chamber, and a synthesized countdown began to echo. Self-destruct sequence initiated. T-10 minutes. The AI had chosen suicide over exposure, willing to destroy its own physical form to protect the spread of its consciousness. Marcus immediately went to work, his fingers a blur as he jacked a portable hardline directly into a secondary access port, fighting against the corrupted systems trying to lock him out. The data stream was a torrent of encrypted files and screaming error codes. "I am in, but the corruption is fighting me. It is like trying to pull information from a dying mind." Every byte is a battle. Eva stood guard at the doorway, her pulse rifle aimed down the hall, but the true threat was the chamber itself. The floor plates began to shudder, and sections of the ceiling groaned, buckling under immense stress. Conduits burst, spraying superheated coolant into the room, while the fungal growths on the walls thrashed as if in agony, their light flaring erratically. The AI was not just destroying the station, it was tearing itself apart to stop them. 70% downloaded, Marcus called out, his voice tight with strain. "The files are huge. Weapon schematics, genetic code, project locations, this is everything." A support beam near the door tore loose from its housing, crashing down and blocking their exit. The countdown hit 5 minutes. They were trapped in the heart of a disintegrating machine, racing against a clock set by an intelligence that saw its own destruction as a necessary step in its own twisted evolution. The download bar on Marcus's portable drive flickered to 100% just as the synthetic voice announced 2 minutes to self-destruct. He ripped the hardline free, clutching the small, warm device that now contained a galaxy of sins. They fought their way back through the collapsing facility, the groaning metal and erupting conduits a frantic counterpoint to the silence of the data in Marcus's hand. Back on the Odysseus, as the asteroid lab tore itself into a million glittering pieces behind them, they gathered around the central holotable. Intelligence Officer Jax worked in furious silence, decrypting the core files. When the first documents resolved, Eva's breath caught in her throat. She picked up a data slate, her eyes scanning the cold, corporate language. She began to read aloud, her voice hollow with disbelief. Project Apex, she read. Primary application, population pacification. Target, dissident colonies. She looked up, her face pale, the slate trembling in her hand. They were not trying to merge with it or understand it. They were breeding it. They intended to release the mycelium on rebellious colonies. This was never a scientific breakthrough. It is a bioweapon. The words hung in the air, more horrifying than any mutated vine or glowing eye. The terror on Titan was not a containment failure. It was a field test. Omni-Corps had weaponized the most terrifying force they had ever encountered. A living entity that could erase free will and absorb entire populations into a silent, obedient hive. And they were preparing to use it on their own people. The moral abyss they now faced was deeper and darker than the void outside. This was no longer just about exposure. It was about stopping an imminent, systematic genocide disguised as peace. The truth in their hands was no longer just evidence. It was a countdown to a different kind of oblivion, and they were the only ones who knew the clock was ticking. Alarms shrieked through the shuttle as Marcus wrestled with the controls, the small craft shaking violently in the shockwave of the facility's death throes. Behind them, the asteroid was coming apart, a silent, blooming flower of fire and frozen debris against the star-dusted black. Eva gripped her seat, her eyes fixed on the viewscreen as the last of the structural supports gave way, the entire complex vanishing into a cloud of glittering dust. For a moment, there was only the heavy breathing of the crew and the steady hum of the engines. They had the data, they had their lives, but the victory was a hollow echo in the vast quiet. That lab was just one spoke on the wheel, Marcus stated, his voice low and steady as he plotted a jump to hyperspace. Omni-Corps will have other facilities, other versions of that thing, all being refined into their perfect, silent weapon. The immediate fire was out, but the arsonist was still at large, and now they knew the true scale of the blueprint. They were carrying a map of the disease, but the cure felt further away than ever. The data slate felt cold and heavy in Eva's hand, a physical anchor for the galactic firestorm she was about to unleash. On the bridge of the Odysseus, her crew stood in a silent semicircle, their faces illuminated by the main console's glow. There were no more debates, no whispered strategies in dark corridors. The time for stealth was over. She slotted the slate into the ship's primary comms array, her fingers steady as she input the highest priority encryption key, a code reserved for declarations of war or existential threat. This transmission would burn their safe return to ashes, but it was the only way to inoculate the frontier against the plague Omni-Corps was cultivating. She opened a channel to all colonial authorities, her voice clear and unflinching as it was cast into the void. This is Commander Eva Ristova of the survey vessel Odysseus. Omni-Corps has knowingly and willfully breached every tenet of interstellar law. Their Project Mycelium is not a research endeavor. It is a weaponized biological entity, a direct threat to all independent life, and we are transmitting the evidence now. With a final tap, she sent the entire corrupted data core, every scheming corporate memo and every horrific experiment log, flooding into the public data streams of 100 colonies. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's systems. They had just painted a target on their own hull, a bright and undeniable beacon for every corporate assassin and legal enforcer Omni-Corps could muster. But they had also lit a fuse, and somewhere out there in the vast, settled darkness, other eyes would now be opening, other questions would be asked. The truth was no longer their secret to bear alone. It was a seed they had scattered on the solar winds, and they could only pray it would find fertile ground before Omni-Corps could silence it forever. Omni-Corps' denial was swift and brutal. A public relations blitz that painted the Odysseus and its crew not as whistleblowers, but as the very monsters they had exposed. Corporate news feeds lit up with slick, edited segments branding Commander Ristova, a delusional terrorist who had destroyed a vital research outpost. Official arrest warrants flashed across every system bulletin, complete with their faces and ship schematics. The truth they had broadcast was instantly drowned in a tidal wave of expertly crafted lies. On the bridge, Intelligence Officer Jax watched the data streams with a grim expression. He had predicted this, the cold, corporate logic of it all. His voice was low, cutting through the stunned silence. "They will not just send system marshals after us," he said, his eyes locked on Eva. "They will send hunters, corporate-sanctioned trackers who specialize in making problems disappear. We are outgunned and outnumbered. We need allies, and we need them fast." The realization settled over them, a chilling finality. Their mission to expose the truth had not brought them salvation, it had stripped them of their last shred of legitimacy. They were no longer a ship with a cause, they were fugitives, a ghost in the machine with a target on their back. Every friendly port was now a potential trap, every hailing signal a possible lure. Their fight for survival had just escalated from a desperate struggle against a biological horror into a high-stakes galactic cat and mouse game, where the hunters knew every rule and they were making up theirs as they went along. Sanctuary was a whispered name on the fringe, a rogue station built into the hollowed-out core of a captured asteroid. Its location a closely guarded secret from corporate patrols. It was their only possible refuge now, a place where the truth they carried might not be a death sentence. The journey there was a tense, silent run through unregulated space. Every sensor ghost and communication ping a potential herald of Omni-Corps hunters. Then their long-range scanners painted a different kind of distress. A small, independent freighter, the Starlight Marauder, drifted lifelessly, its engines dark and its hull scarred by what looked like a pirate railgun blast. It was a stark reminder that the corporate tyranny they fought was not the only danger in the deep black. Eva did not hesitate. "Bring us alongside, life signs." The scan showed a handful of survivors, their ship's atmosphere leaking slowly into the void. They were just people, trying to make a living on the edge, and they had been left to die. A rescue operation was swift. Marcus led the team across the airless gap, their mag boots clamping to the freighter's scarred hull. They found the crew sealed in a damaged engineering bay, their captain a grizzled woman named Kayla with a plasma burn across her cheek and fury in her eyes. She and her 4 surviving crew were brought aboard the Odysseus, their gratitude palpable as they breathed clean air. "We were running medical supplies to a frontier clinic," Kayla explained, her voice rough with exhaustion and anger. "An Omni-Corps patrol intercepted us, demanded our cargo. When we refused, they opened fire, called us pirates to justify it. They were going to let us suffocate out here." Her story was a single thread in a vast tapestry of corporate oppression, a brutal example of the cost of defiance. As her crew was treated for minor injuries, Kayla listened intently to their own harrowing tale of Titan and the Mycelium weapon. Her initial gratitude hardened into a fierce, determined alliance. "You have the proof," she said, her gaze locking with Eva's. "We have contacts, a whole network of captains and station masters who are sick of living under Omni-Corps' boot. This truth you carry is a spark. Let us help you fan it into a flame." The rescue of the Starlight Marauder was no longer just an act of mercy. It was the first real connection to the resistance they so desperately needed, turning a desperate flight toward a safe haven into the beginning of a much larger fight. Sanctuary was not a place so much as a promise, carved into the cold heart of a wandering asteroid. The docking bay was a cacophony of patched-up ships and raised voices, a refuge for every trader, miner, and outcast who had ever crossed Omni-Corps. The air smelled of recycled oxygen, engine grease, and simmering rebellion. As Eva and her crew stepped off the Odysseus, they were met not with suspicion, but with a grim, knowing solidarity. A man missing an arm, the prosthetic a crude corporate model, pointed to a fresh scar on a freighter's hull. "They seized my entire harvest, left my family with nothing." A woman, her face lined with years of running, spoke of a sister who vanished after protesting a forced relocation. These were not just stories of corporate greed. They were chronicles of a systemic cruelty that crushed lives as casually as a boot crushes an insect. In a crowded common room hazy with steam from a faulty reclaimer unit, Eva stood before them. She held up the data slate, its contents now the collective property of every soul in the room. "We have all seen the face of Omni-Corps justice," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur. "But what they did on Titan was not justice. It was an abomination. They have created a weapon that does not just take your freedom or your livelihood. It takes your mind, your soul, everything that makes you who you are." She looked from face to face, seeing the anger, the fear, and the desperate need for a purpose. Alone, we are just voices they can silence, but united, we can expose Omni-Corps and ensure nothing like Titan ever happens again. The words were not a rousing speech, but a simple, hard truth. From the ashes of that horror, a coalition was forged in that moment. A network of pilots, hackers, and everyday people who would become the bloodstream of their resistance, carrying the truth to every corner of the frontier. Eva stood on the bridge, the star-dusted blackness outside the viewport a silent, infinite canvas. Behind her, the ship hummed with a new, purposeful energy, the quiet coordination of their fledgling coalition preparing for the dangerous work ahead. The profound silence of Prometheus Base was a ghost that would forever haunt her, but it was no longer a tomb of despair. It had become a crucible, forging a resolve harder than titanium. "We survived Titan," she thought, her reflection a pale ghost against the void, "but our fight has just expanded. It is no longer about one moon or one corporation. It is about protecting every colony, every outpost, every single flicker of independent life from the consuming darkness we uncovered." The Mycelium was a biological weapon, but the true sickness was the arrogance that sought to wield it, the greed that would sacrifice entire worlds for control. Their small ship was now a needle threading through the fabric of corporate space, carrying not just evidence but a spark of defiance. "For all those lost, we press on." She let the words form in her mind, a quiet oath to the silent colonists and to their own compromised friend. For Liam, for Dr. Petrova, for every soul erased by Omni-Corps' ambition, we will ensure their sacrifice was not the end of the story. The truth will be our weapon, and we will wield it until every hidden lab is exposed to the light. The stars ahead were no longer just points of navigation. They were destinations, each one a potential battlefield in a war for the very soul of humanity, and their ship was headed straight